The whispering waves. Emily had always loved the beach. The soothing sound of waves, the warmth of the sun on her skin, the taste of salt in the air, it was her happy place. But after what happened that summer night, she would never look at the ocean the same way again. It was a balmy evening in July when Emily and her friends decided to have a bonfire on a secluded stretch of beach. They laughed and drank as the sky turned from gold to inky black, the flames casting flickering shadows across their faces. As midnight approached, the others started to pack up, but Emily lingered, entranced by the moonlight glittering on the water. "I'm going to stay a bit longer," she told her friends. "I'll catch up with you guys later." They hesitated, but Emily insisted she'd be fine on her own. As their voices faded into the distance, she walked down to where the waves lapped at the shore. The water was surprisingly warm as it swirled around her ankles. Emily closed her eyes, breathing in the salty air. That's when she heard it, a faint whisper carried on the breeze. Her eyes snapped open, searching the darkness. But she was alone on the empty beach. "Hello?" she called out tentatively. Only the crash of waves answered. Emily shook her head, chalking it up to too much wine. But as she turned to head back, she heard it again, clearer this time. A woman's voice, soft but urgent. "Help us." A chill ran down Emily's spine. The voice seemed to be coming from the water. She peered out at the dark ocean, straining to see anything in the moonlight. For a moment, she thought she glimpsed pale faces bobbing just beneath the surface. But that was impossible. Heart racing, Emily stumbled backwards. She needed to get out of there. But as she turned to run, icy fingers wrapped around her ankle. With a scream of terror, she was yanked off her feet and dragged into the frigid water. Emily thrashed wildly, fighting to keep her head above the surface. All around her, corpse-white faces emerged from the waves. Dozens of them, their eyes dark hollows, mouths gaping in silent screams. Spectral hands clutched at her, trying to pull her under. "Join us," they whispered in unison. "Stay with us forever." Emily's lungs burned as she struggled against the phantom grip. Just as she was about to go under, her fingers brushed against a piece of driftwood. She clung to it desperately, kicking with all her might to propel herself back to shore. After what felt like hours, she finally dragged herself onto the beach, coughing and sputtering. Emily lay there shaking, too terrified to move. As the sun began to rise, she slowly lifted her head to look out at the ocean. The water was calm and empty, with no sign of the horrors she'd encountered. But Emily knew what she had seen, and she would never forget the unearthly whispers that still echoed in her mind. "We'll be waiting for you." The dunes. Jake had always been a daredevil, the first to accept any challenge. So when his buddies dared him to spend the night alone in the sand dunes, he didn't hesitate. "You guys are a bunch of wusses," he scoffed. "I'll show you there's nothing to be scared of." If only he had listened to the warnings of the locals. The dunes had a dark history. Over the years, dozens of people had vanished without a trace among the shifting sands. But Jake brushed off the superstitious tales. As dusk fell, he hiked out to the tallest dune with his sleeping bag and a flashlight. His friends waved goodbye, promising to pick him up in the morning. Jake settled in for the night, admiring the starry sky above. The gentle whisper of wind over sand soon lulled him to sleep. He awoke with a start several hours later, disoriented. The stars were obscured by thick fog that seemed to glow faintly. And the dunes, they looked different somehow. Taller, closer. Jake rubbed his eyes, assuming it was just a trick of the light. But as he looked around, he realized with growing dread that the landscape had completely changed. The dune he'd been sleeping on had tripled in size, looming ominously above him. And the other dunes seemed to have shifted, creating a maze-like array of towering sand walls. Heart-pounding, Jake grabbed his gear and began to walk, trying to get his bearings. But every direction looked the same in the eerie fog. After what felt like hours, he realized he was hopelessly lost. That's when he first heard it, a low humming sound, like voices chanting in the distance. Jake spinning around wildly, trying to pinpoint the source. It seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. The chanting grew louder, and Jake broke into a run. He scrambled up the side of a dune, sand sliding beneath his feet. When he reached the top, he froze in horror at the sight below. Dozens of emaciated figures were emerging from the sand, their desiccated flesh gray and crumbling. They moved in a jerky, unnatural way as they began to climb the dune toward him. Jake's scream caught in his throat as he tumbled backwards, rolling down the other side. He hit the ground running, weaving between the dunes as the chanting echoed all around him. No matter which way he turned, more of the sand-crusted creatures appeared, their hollow eyes fixed on him with predatory hunger. Just when Jake thought he couldn't run anymore, he caught a glimpse of light in the distance. Summoning the last of his strength, he sprinted toward it. As he got closer, he realized it was the glow of headlights. His friends had come back early to check on him. Jake burst out of the dunes onto the main beach, screaming for help. His friends leapt out of the car in alarm as he collapsed at their feet. When they helped him up, Jake turned back toward the dunes, but they appeared normal in the morning light. No monstrous creatures, no maze-like towers of sand. Had it all been a nightmare? But as they drove away, Jake looked in the side mirror and glimpsed a withered hand reaching out of the sand, beckoning. He never set foot on that beach again. The lighthouse. Sarah had always been fascinated by the old lighthouse that stood on the rocky cliffs overlooking the beach. It had been abandoned for decades, but locals whispered that on stormy nights, an eerie light could sometimes be seen glowing from the top. Despite the warnings to stay away, Sarah couldn't resist the urge to explore. One overcast afternoon, she slipped away from her family on the beach and made her way up the overgrown path to the lighthouse. The salty wind whipped her hair as she approached the weathered structure. Sarah tried the door, surprised to find it unlocked. It creaked open ominously. Inside, dust motes swirled in the dim light filtering through grimy windows. Sarah's footsteps echoed as she crossed the room to the spiral staircase. She hesitated for a moment, then began to climb. Round and round she went, the stairs seeming to go on forever. Sarah was breathing heavily by the time she finally reached the top. The views from the narrow walkway were spectacular, crashing waves visible for miles. But it was the massive lens in the center of the room that drew Sarah's attention. Even coated in years of grime, it was impressive. She reached out to touch the cool glass. The moment her fingers made contact, a jolt of electricity shot through her body. Sarah jerked back with a gasp as the lens began to glow with an otherworldly blue light. A high-pitched whine filled the air, building in intensity until it was almost unbearable. Clapping her hands over her ears, Sarah staggered toward the stairs. But they were gone. The entrance had vanished, leaving only smooth wall. She was trapped. The phantom light pulsed brighter, and Sarah screamed as spectral shapes began to coalesce in the air around her. Ghostly sailors in old-fashioned uniforms, their flesh rotting and waterlogged. A woman in a Victorian dress, seaweed tangled in her hair. Children with sunken eyes, their skin bleached white. They converged on Sarah, ethereal hands grasping at her clothes, her hair. Their touches burned like ice. Unearthly voices echoed in her mind. "You've come to join us. You'll never leave. The lighthouse must be tended. Forever." Sarah thrashed wildly, trying to break free of their grip. In her panic, she lost her footing and crashed into the lens. There was a blinding flash of blue light, and then darkness. Hours later, Sarah's frantic family found her unconscious on the beach below the lighthouse, battered and soaked to the bone. When she finally came to, she had no memory of what had happened. But for years after, she was haunted by nightmares of ghostly figures and an endless spiral staircase. And on stormy nights, locals swear they sometimes see a small figure moving behind the lens, keeping the unearthly light burning. The siren's call. Mark had always been drawn to the sea. As a child, he would spend hours splashing in the waves, imagining fantastical underwater worlds. Now as an adult, he was an avid surfer, never happier than when he was riding the swells. So when he heard about a secluded cove that was said to have the best waves around, Mark knew he had to check it out. The locals warned him that the area was dangerous, with treacherous riptides and jagged rocks hidden beneath the surface. Some even spoke in hushed tones of swimmers who had vanished there, lured to their doom by mysterious singing. Mark scoffed at their superstitions. He was an experienced surfer. He could handle whatever the ocean threw at him. The cove was even more beautiful than he had imagined. Sheer cliffs surrounded a crescent of white sand, the water a mesmerizing turquoise. Mark paddled out eagerly, thrilled to have the perfect waves all to himself. For hours he rode the swells, enjoying the solitude. As the sun began to set, he decided to catch one last wave before heading in. That's when he heard it, a haunting melody carried on the breeze. The voice was impossibly beautiful, seeming to call to him personally. Entranced, Mark allowed himself to be pulled further out to sea, desperate to find the source of the ethereal singing. The sky darkened and the waves grew choppy, but he barely noticed. All that mattered was following that voice. Suddenly, something grabbed his ankle, yanking him off his board. Mark plunged beneath the surface, the salt water burning his eyes. Through the murk, he saw a pale face inches from his own, inhumanly beautiful, with iridescent scales shimming across porcelain skin. Sharp teeth flashed in a predatory grin as webbed hands encircled his throat. Mark thrashed wildly, his lungs burning for air. But the creature's grip was inhumanly strong as it pulled him deeper into the inky blackness. Just as his vision began to fade, Mark caught a glimpse of dozens more figures emerging from the gloom. Siren-like beings with needle-sharp teeth and claws, their eyes glowing with unholy hunger. The last thing he heard before consciousness slipped away was that haunting melody, now tinged with malevolent glee. Mark's body was never found, but his broken surfboard washed up on shore days later, with deep claw marks gouged into the fiberglass. To this day, locals claim that on quiet nights, you can sometimes hear faint singing coming from that secluded cove. But those who value their lives know to stay far away from its deceptively beautiful waters. The Sandman's Revenge. For generations, parents had used the myth of the Sandman to coax children to sleep. Just a harmless fairy tale, or so everyone thought. But sometimes, old legends have a way of coming to life. It started with whispered rumors among the locals, children complaining of nightmares about a shadowy figure watching them as they slept. A few even claimed to have woken up with sand in their eyes and sheets. Most dismissed it as overactive imaginations. But then children started to vanish from their beds in the night. At first it was just one or two. Then dozens. Police were baffled. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence left behind. It was as if the kids had simply disappeared into thin air. Panic gripped the town as parents kept terrified vigil over their children's bedsides. But no matter how closely they watched, more continued to vanish. Those who did manage to avoid being taken spoke of a tall, gaunt figure with glowing yellow eyes who would materialize out of the shadows. They said he sprinkled magical sand in their eyes, paralyzing them as he spirited their siblings away. Finally, a group of desperate parents decided to follow the Sandman to his lair. They tracked mysterious footprints in the sand to a system of caves beneath the cliffs. What they found inside would haunt them forever. The caverns were vast, the walls coated in a strange, phosphorescent sand that cast everything in an eerie glow. And there, suspended from the ceiling in silken cocoons, were the missing children, dozens of them, locked in an unnatural slumber. The Sandman himself loomed in the shadows, his form seeming to shift and writhe. When he spoke, his voice was like the hiss of sand through an hourglass. For centuries, you humans have used my name to frighten your young. You've twisted my purpose, turned me into a boogeyman. So now I've come to collect what's owed. These children will sleep forever in my realm of dreams. Their youth and innocence will sustain me for eternity. The parents fought bravely, but their weapons passed harmlessly through the Sandman's shifting form. One by one, he overpowered them with his enchanted sand. The few who managed to escape fled back to town, but their wild tales were dismissed as mass hysteria. To this day, the Sandman continues his grim work. Parents warn their children to be good, lest the yellow-eyed specter come for them in the night. And sometimes, when the wind blows just right, you can hear the faint, echoing cries of lost children, forever trapped in an endless dream beneath the sand. The Tides of Terror. The beachside town of Seaview had always been a popular vacation spot. Tourists flocked there every summer, drawn by the quaint shops, picturesque lighthouse, and miles of pristine shoreline. But the locals knew the dark secret that lurked beneath the waves. It started gradually, beachgoers complaining of something brushing against their legs in the water. A few reported seeing strange shapes moving beneath the surface. Most assumed it was just seaweed or fish. But then the attacks began. At first, just a few isolated incidents, swimmers dragged under, their mangled bodies washing up days later. The authorities blamed it on sharks or riptides. But the locals knew better. They had heard the old stories, passed down through generations, tales of an ancient, aquatic race that had once ruled the seas. Amphibious creatures of terrifying strength and cunning, with an insatiable hunger for human flesh. They had been driven to the ocean depths eons ago, but now something had drawn them back to the surface. As the body count rose, panic gripped the town. The beaches were closed, but it didn't stop the creatures. They began emerging at night, dragging screaming victims from beachfront homes. Their numbers grew with each attack, as if they were building an army. The military was called in, but their weapons seemed useless against the monster's impenetrable scales. Evacuation efforts quickly turned to chaos as people fled in terror. Those who couldn't escape barricaded themselves in their homes, listening to the inhuman shrieks that echoed through the night. Now Seaview is a ghost town, abandoned to the horrors that emerged from the sea. The beaches are littered with bones, the waters stained red. And still the creatures come, venturing further inland in search of fresh prey. Some say that on foggy nights, you can see pale shapes moving in the surf, hear the scrape of claws on sand. The luckiest ones only catch a glimpse of glowing eyes and needle-sharp teeth before the attack comes. So beware if you visit this quiet coastal town. That inviting shoreline hides untold terrors. And once the tides of horror are unleashed, there's no escaping their hungry grasp.